Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I last recorded anything. I've been quite busy on my end with coven activities and training new people. In the Sacred Pentagraph Coven, we have a few people who are actually moving into new roles. And recently in the Horsa Coven, which, as you probably know, is a fairly new coven for us here in Edmonton, and we had some students move into covener roles. So we would have more space to train more people because as you can imagine, teaching new people for us, there's a finite capacity to be able to do that. So today in this video, what I'm going to be talking about is actually inspired by one of my own initiates. They suggested that I put together a YouTube video where I talk about considerations regarding moving through the degrees in witchcraft, and I am not actually going to be talking about the degree requirements per se, but I will rather be talking about some of the things that come from the perspective of us as teachers. So, what we might want to consider when deciding if someone is ready to progress to the next level of initiation. Now, one of the major aspects of witchcraft is actually the practice of spells and thought projection within small groups of individuals who are bound together by shared rituals and ceremonies. Sybil Leek actually also expressed this in one of her classic texts, that is Cast Your Own Spell, where she said something along the lines of, people need spells, but the most effective one is to reach a point in life when you know your place in the universe and you know the exhilarated magical feeling of a harmonious existence within your environment and with your fellow man. So when we're working in groups, the unity of purpose and method is actually of supreme importance. So the existence and maintenance of that perfect harmony between members of, say, a coven is really essential. So it can be quite difficult for new people to understand that when you enter into a particular path or particular tradition, that you are not actually entering a formal learning institution like, say, a university or a college or whatever, where some branches of witchcraft have a system in place where a neophyte is in training for, say, a year and a day, after which you may be eligible for initiation. Now, some other branches also have a system where you progress to the next degree after a year and a day has passed, provided that you have mastered the fundamental things that are expected of you at that specific degree or level. Now, I would say that many of us in our tradition do not follow that specific way of thinking. The Sacred Pentagraph books do have, for example, suggestions of what would typically be an appropriate length of time for first degrees or neophytes, and they would provide guidelines and topics that students should master before progressing. But typically, the length of time spent as a neophyte, which is often left up to the individual teachers and the individual members of the high priesthood. Now, each teacher also has their own specific style of teaching, and some teachers have hard and fast guidelines in terms of things that they would want to teach their students. Some teachers prefer to teach their students organically, where, say, the student is taught concepts and those concepts are explained as and when they want to learn specific things. Now, other teachers have very specific curriculums and syllabus where usually those are provided to the new students who have little or no information on the occult and witchcraft. Often these lessons are only presented for a year or so, but many teachers have a sort of blended approach where they may have an entirely different approach too, where they might refine and change their way of teaching over time as they see what works for them. So training in witchcraft cannot really be thought of in the same way as training at a university or a college. It is also important to understand that not all students are going to be taught in the same way. And that's often something that's very hard for new students to actually understand. Now, the tradition is taught and passed down from initiate to initiate. And how that is passed down is actually up to the individual teacher. No one is going to oversee your teaching group, and it is up to the person in charge of teaching to decide what is best both for themselves in terms of things like their workload and the amount of students that they can potentially train. This is because not all teachers have the same amount or the allotment of time to teach on a weekly basis and so on. So every teacher is really going to decide what is best for their specific group. Now, it's also really important to understand that there is really no standardized checklist or specific rubric that has the capacity of sort of measuring the overall progress of a neophyte or an initiate. If we were, for the sake of illustration, to say make up a checklist, we might find that the candidate meets the requirements of things in terms of having mastered specific concepts on paper, but that may not actually be enough to consider them for initiation. So, for example, if a neophyte has mastered all of the things that have been laid out for them and put together in the curriculum that covers the most sort of fundamental basic things that they need to know before initiation into the first degree, that does not automatically mean that they are going to be initiated, number one. And it also doesn't mean that they are going to necessarily be a good fit for the specific tradition or say for my coven. For example, let's say a neophyte has mastered the fundamentals, but is also either a combination or is some of these things. Like, say, they are argumentative, disruptive, perhaps really mentally unstable. Sometimes people like to cause a lot of drama. These are the sort of things that would exclude them from initiation, for me at least. Um, Naturally, of course, I would have addressed these issues with the neophyte repeatedly prior to actually coming to that decision, and I would have suggested ways for them to improve their behavior or so on. So there really are many more examples of what would exclude people from initiation, including things like skipping classes, not participating, not doing their homework, not bringing the required supplies in order to be able to accomplish what they need to do in the class, or always having excuses for what they did not do when they were asked to do it, and so on. Now, another thing that seekers and initiates alike don't often understand is that the length of time, competency, and so on in the occult arts are not the only considerations that are made when decisions are contemplated about whether somebody is ready to move to the next degree. We know that the length of time a person has been involved in a coven or has been in occult type settings does not actually equal the necessary understandings or wisdom of our tradition's religious or occult system. The length of time someone has been practicing also is not the main factor when we are considering initiation or progression through the degree system. The initiate may need more experiences in the actual tradition itself, or may also need more time to gain wisdom. Sometimes the total chronological length of time that a person has spent practicing a particular tradition does not equal understanding. I'd like you to remember that when I'm talking through all of these are things that I personally would consider when I'm thinking about somebody progressing through the degrees or to the next degree. Now, there are many other things that would be contemplated when making a decision or about to make a decision about somebody moving on to the next degrees. Or if they're a neophyte, may not be considered for initiation at all. And some of these things would include a lack of personal mastery, not having enough wisdom and experience or experience of mundane life. So, other things also to be considered are things like personal emotional regulation, the lack of stability or poor financial choices or poor finances, or the unstable living conditions, for example, not having developed socialization skills, not conforming to groups' conduct or community standards, or not being able to communicate effectively, the inability or the unwillingness to make friends, or not having meaningful personal connection with others, because all of these things will impact the harmony of the overall functioning of the group. Now, I personally would also not be willing to progress somebody to the next degree or even initiate them if they have a disregard for their fellow covenants, for tradition members, or even actually the public at large. So, for example, when an initiate may threaten to maliciously hex or curse somebody without first seriously contemplating the consequences of their actions. Because when these things happen, irreparable damage to relationships comes from this type of behavior. So, here I'm not talking about resorting to cursing as a type of last resort after you have gone through all of the mundane methods of dealing with interpersonal problems. Um, I am talking about things where I've trained my initiates to first resort to methods of open communication, negotiation, and conflict resolution. So I would be very much more likely to exclude people from initiation if they would first resort to hexing or cursing without actually engaging in methods of communication, negotiation, conflict resolution, and other mundane ways of trying to restore balance and harmony first. To me, this kind of indicates a lack of maturity and wisdom. It also means that the person involved is not really aiming to follow our religious tenets, does not really grasp or understand the axioms and precepts and the laws of the craft. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is that seekers and initiates alike often don't understand that the length of time does not equal competency in the occult arts, and that they're not the only considerations that are made when we talk about or start to think about whether somebody is ready to progress to the next degree. We know that the length of time a person has been involved in a coven or an occult type setting does not equal the necessary understanding or wisdom of, say, specifically our tradition's religious or occult system. Now, also when people are given an opportunity to, say, start a teaching group, or where they reach, in the sacred pentagraph tradition, they may reach the level of artisan second degree, where that will give them the ability to start a teaching group or to be assistant teachers. Um, that does not entitle them automatically to progress to the next level. People are given opportunities with the guidance and wisdom of members of the high priesthood. And so they enter this role of apprenticeship, for example. But that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be promoted to the next level of, say, handmaiden, practicus, or eventually high priesthood. Um, there are many things that need to be considered for people to step into the role of high priesthood, because there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that role or that initiation level. There are also many personal traits and considerations that need to be taken into account when we are thinking about progressing somebody to the high priesthood, some of which I mentioned earlier. Now, there are other things that specifically need to be considered when contemplating whether somebody is ready to move into that role. Because as we know, with a role comes specific responsibilities. So when people are being considered, things like their life experience are thought about, their personal finances, the space they have available, the specific individual's motivation, like how motivated are they to do all of that work, the amount of time that they may have available to dedicate to the task. Sometimes we would even consider personality traits like, are they good natured people and similar type things. All of these mundane type things, along with actual craft knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, and so on, will determine how successful somebody is going to be. Now, these conditions are obviously not perfect, and not everything has to be perfectly in place for the person to progress. But these are things that we think about and considerations that we take into account, because we're not usually in the habit of trying to set people up for failure. So, the things that we're talking about in terms of personality traits and things like that are very important considerations. Now, another thing related to considerations that I briefly want to mention is that, and I think I just want to really briefly talk about this, is that we are never promised initiation, and a person is never promised initiation even to the next degree, and it's certainly not an entitlement. Um, we were given an opportunity at the beginning to learn and grow because our teachers decided to give us an opportunity to try and prove that we are worthy candidates. In reality, there are actually many, many, many people who are turned away so that one or two people are given the chance and the space and time to learn. And that's given by goodwill and grace by the teachers, but nobody is actually entitled or deserving of their time. This is why we as initiates have so much gratitude and appreciation for our own teachers, because they gave us that opportunity to learn and grow and develop. Now, I've had a lot to say in this video, but I just wanted to sort of end off by saying these are some of the things that I would consider when I am thinking about somebody moving on to the next degree. But it's a consideration. It doesn't mean that ultimately, if all of these sort of criteria are not met, it doesn't necessarily mean the person will not progress to the next level. It's also very important to understand when you are thinking about initiation and the progression through degrees that with each degree actually comes responsibility. And it, in order to step into a specific role, you need to have some of these personality traits and things that will enable you to be successful, to be able to fulfill your role and to live up to the responsibilities that you are given that comes along with this role. I hope that you found some useful information in this video. I hope to have some more time available to record more videos pretty soon. Blessed be.